All right, freaks, welcome back. I know you're here for the nightmares and terror, so I won't waste time with pleasantries. Let's get right into it. Tonight we're talking about something that'll make you rethink every knock at your door. You ever hear the term black-eyed children? No? Well, buckle up, because by the end of this story you're going to be checking your locks twice. And before we get into the thick of it, gotta give a shout out to all the twisted souls watching, especially my girl queen G5925. We're like two witches casting the same curse. Now, let's get into this horror. It was Halloween night, and Dave had no idea what he was about to walk into. He lived in a quiet neighborhood where nothing happened unless it was a Sunday BBQ. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across his street, and the last trick-or-treaters had already come and gone. Dave, a grumpy loner by nature, was looking forward to a night of cheap beer and a crappy horror movie marathon. The evening was as ordinary as it could get, until there was a knock at the door. He froze for a second. Who the hell knocks at this time? He hadn't put out decorations, hadn't left the porch light on. Everything screamed, "Don't bother me." With a sigh, he got up, thinking it was probably some kid who'd forgotten to go home. Opening the door, his stomach twisted immediately. Standing on the porch were two kids. At first glance, they seemed normal enough, maybe a little out of place, given that they weren't wearing any costumes. But it wasn't the lack of costumes that set Dave's nerves on edge. It was the way they stood, rigid, like they didn't belong in their own skin. And then, the way they stared, heads tilted downward, but something about them. It felt wrong, like looking at a picture that wasn't quite finished. "Can we come in?" The voice was flat, emotionless, but it was the way they spoke together that really creeped him out. Like they were one, not two separate kids. A cold shiver ran down his spine, instinct kicking in. "No, you can't come in. Where are your parents?" Silence. They didn't flinch, didn't move. And then one of them finally raised their head slowly, like it hurt to do so. Dave's blood turned to ice. The kid's eyes, they were black. Not just dark, not just the way someone's pupils dilate when the lights are low. These were full-on pitch-black orbs, empty voids where their eyes should be. The kid blinked, and it wasn't like a normal blink. It was slow, deliberate, almost like a reptile. "Please let us in," the other one said, still looking down, but the voice seemed to crawl under Dave's skin. He took a step back, gripping the door, his heart racing in his chest. "No," he said, voice shaking now. "You need to leave." The two kids just stood there, like statues, eyes locked on him. The first kid took a step forward, their movements jerky, unnatural. That's when the pain hit. A sharp, searing pain shot through Dave's head, so intense he had to grip the side of the door to steady himself. It was as if something was reaching into his skull and squeezing his brain. He gasped, feeling like he was suffocating under an invisible weight. The air around him grew cold, too cold for a Halloween night, and he could see his breath hanging in the air. The kids were still there, still staring, and then they smiled. But it wasn't a smile that belonged on a child. It was slow, too wide, lips stretching far beyond what was normal, revealing teeth that were far too sharp. The pressure in his head intensified, making his vision blur. He could feel the air being pulled from his lungs, as if something was drawing his very life away. His knees buckled, and he stumbled backward into the house, slamming the door with what little strength he had left. The pain stopped. Instantly, he collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat. His head was spinning, heart hammering so loud he could hear it in his ears. For a few minutes, he just sat there, staring at the door, afraid to move, afraid they'd still be there. What the hell just happened? His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he saw. It couldn't be real. Kids don't have black eyes. Kids don't do that. He had to be losing it. Maybe it was the beer. Maybe it was a Halloween prank gone too far. But when he finally got the nerve to look through the peephole, his blood froze again. They were still there, standing perfectly still, staring at the door. Not knocking, not moving, just waiting. And then slowly they turned and walked away. But it wasn't the way people walked. Their movements were off, almost like they were floating, like their feet barely touched the ground. Dave watched until they disappeared into the shadows of the street, the darkness swallowing them whole. He slammed his back against the wall, heart still pounding, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He should call someone, the police. But what the hell was he supposed to say? "Hey, I've got a couple of demon kids with black eyes at my door." Yeah, right. He'd be locked up in a psych ward by morning, but something felt wrong. It wasn't just fear now. It was something deeper, darker, like the air around him had thickened, and he could feel eyes on him from every corner of the room. The atmosphere had shifted, the shadows seemed heavier, and his vision was starting to blur again. The pain in his head was creeping back, slow and steady, like a vice tightening around his skull. He stumbled to his couch, grabbing his phone, needing to hear another voice, anyone. He dialed his brother, but the line was dead. No signal. He tried again, nothing. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the house plunged into darkness. The sound of soft knocking filled the air, not on the door, but from the windows, from all of them. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of tiny fingers drumming on the glass, soft but insistent, like they knew he was trapped. The pain in his head grew worse, and his vision started to fade. The last thing he saw before passing out was a face at the window, those same black eyes staring in at him. Dave woke hours later, sprawled on the floor, his head pounding. The sun had risen, casting weak light through the windows. His phone was lying next to him, cracked. He sat up slowly, his whole body aching as if he'd been hit by a truck. He blinked against the light, trying to piece together the night before. It felt like a fever dream, something his brain had cooked up after one too many beers. But then he saw it, on the floor by the front door. A single footprint, small, wet, as if from a child who had been standing inside his house. Dave knew something terrible was coming. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room. He felt as though he was running out of time. As darkness started to seep in, the tapping noises grew louder. They were faint at first, barely noticeable, but now they were unmistakable, coming from the windows, the walls, even the ceiling. It was as if the house itself was alive, echoing the presence of something sinister. His phone buzzed again, another message. "Let us in." Dave's throat went dry. His pulse quickened. This wasn't a prank. He knew that now. Whatever those children were, they were coming back, and this time they wouldn't wait for permission. The stories he'd read online were playing on a loop in his mind. People marked by the black-eyed children always ended up worse than before. Some disappeared without a trace. Some were found dead in their homes, pale and gaunt, as if something had drained the life out of them. The ones who lived weren't really living. They were haunted, their minds shattered. He couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let them inside again. But his head was pounding, his vision swimming as the pressure returned, heavier this time, like a force squeezing his skull from all sides. The tapping at the windows grew louder, more persistent, and then there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Dave felt every hair on his body stand on end. He didn't want to look, but something compelled him to move toward the door. His legs felt heavy, his breathing shallow, but he couldn't stop himself. With trembling hands, he reached for the peephole and peered through. They were there, those same 2 children standing in the faint light of the street lamp. Their faces were still shadowed, but he knew it was them. The same blank expressions, the same dark, empty eyes. They stared straight ahead, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. And then one of them smiled. That same unnatural grin, too wide, too sharp. "Let us in," the voice came again, muffled through the door. It wasn't a question this time. It was a command. Dave felt his knees weaken, the pressure in his head intensifying to the point of nausea. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he might pass out. But he fought it, clinging to the last shred of control he had. He knew what would happen if he opened that door. I won't, he whispered, more to himself than to them. "I won't let you in." The knocking stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and oppressive. Dave's heartbeat echoed in his ears as he waited, his entire body tense with fear. He stepped back from the door, stumbling over his own feet, desperate to put distance between himself and those creatures. But then the tapping started again. This time it was louder, coming from every window in the house. The rhythm was maddening, relentless, like tiny fingers drumming all around him. He spun in a circle, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but it was everywhere, surrounding him, closing in. And then the unmistakable sound of glass cracking. His stomach lurched. One of the windows in the living room had shattered. Without thinking, Dave grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp, and rushed toward the broken window. But when he got there, his heart nearly stopped. The children were gone, but something had come inside. The room felt colder, like the warmth had been sucked out of the air. He could feel it. Something was in the house with him. The shadows seemed to ripple and shift, and for a moment he swore he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned, swinging the lamp wildly, but there was nothing. The pressure in his head grew unbearable. His vision dimmed, and he stumbled, nearly collapsing to the floor. He could barely breathe, his chest tightening as if invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. And then a voice, low and guttural, whispered in his ear, "Let us in!" It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, right next to him. Dave's blood ran cold. He scrambled to his feet, backing into the corner of the room. The shadows seemed to move again, coalescing into something darker, something unnatural. His pulse raced as he watched the darkness take shape. 2 figures, small and childlike, their black eyes gleaming in the dim light. They weren't human. They never had been. The figures moved closer, their steps slow, deliberate, as if they had all the time in the world. Their eyes, those endless black voids, were fixed on him, unblinking, merciless. Dave tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. He could feel his strength slipping away, his body growing weaker with every passing second. They were draining him, just like they had drained the others. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't respond. He was trapped, helpless, as the children loomed over him, their cold hands reaching out. The last thing he saw was their faces, twisted into those grotesque smiles before everything went black. Dave was found 3 days later by his brother. He had missed work, missed calls, and no one had heard from him. When his brother kicked in the door, the house was freezing. Dave's body was slumped in the corner of the living room, his face pale, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. His skin was cold to the touch, and his expression, like Bernard's all those years ago, was frozen in a mask of terror. There were no signs of forced entry, no clues as to what had happened. The police ruled it a natural death, though no one could explain the strange footprints, small, wet, childlike, found by the broken window. And as for the black-eyed children, they'll come knocking again to someone else's door, maybe next Halloween, maybe the one after that. And when they do, remember this: never let them in, because once you do, it's already too late. Well, there you have it, folks. Another poor soul lost to the darkness, all because they made one fatal mistake, letting those creepy little demons into their home. Let this be a lesson to all you out there. The next time someone knocks on your door late at night, especially a couple of kids with eyes blacker than your ex's heart, don't let curiosity get the better of you. Lock the door, turn off the lights, and pray they move on to the next unlucky sucker. Because once they're in, you're as good as gone. Stay twisted, freaks, and remember, Halloween's the time when the veil's thin and the nightmares are real. See you next time if you make it that far.